If you enjoy my stories, please subscribe and hit the like button. I'd really appreciate it. Leave a comment telling me which city you're from and what time it is there. I'm curious to know where my favorite subscribers are from, and share the scariest story that ever happened to you. I'll pin the best one under the video forever. The first time I saw them, I thought they were just neighborhood kids playing late. It was a Tuesday evening in July, and I'd just gotten home from another soul-crushing day at the insurance office, where I'd been working since the divorce. The house felt empty, without Linda's laughter echoing through the rooms, without her humming while she made dinner, without the comfortable sounds of a life shared with someone else. My name is Raymond Miller, though everyone calls me Ray. And at 34 years old, I was learning what it meant to be truly alone for the first time since college. The house on Sycamore Ridge Drive had been our dream home, Linda's and mine, a modest 2-story colonial in one of those quiet suburban neighborhoods where people still waved to each other and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. Now, it felt like a mausoleum, full of memories I couldn't escape and emptiness I couldn't fill. The neighborhood itself was exactly what you'd picture when someone says American suburb. Tree-lined streets with names like Maple Grove Way and Cedar Hill Court, each house separated by neat lawns and chain-link fences, driveways with basketball hoops, and gardens tended by retirees who had nothing but time. It was the kind of place where the most exciting thing that happened was when Mrs. Henderson's cat got stuck in a tree, or when the Johnsons put up Christmas lights before Thanksgiving. Directly across the street from my house was a small playground that had been built sometime in the 80s, back when the neighborhood was new and full of young families. It consisted of a metal slide that had been painted bright red, but was now faded to a rusty orange, a set of swing chains that creaked in even the slightest breeze, a seesaw that tilted permanently to one side, and a sandbox that was mostly weeds now. The whole area was surrounded by a low fence made of those rounded concrete posts, connected by chains, the kind you see around municipal parks. The playground had clearly seen better days. Most of the families in the neighborhood had moved on or grown up, their children now teenagers more interested in smartphones than sandboxes. During the day, it sat empty except for the occasional jogger who might stop to stretch against the fence, or Mrs. Martinez from down the street walking her ancient beagle, Buster. But that Tuesday evening, as I pulled into my driveway and sat in my car for a moment longer than necessary, dreading the walk into another empty house, I noticed movement on the playground. At first glance, it looked like children playing, 3 or 4 small figures scattered around the equipment, moving in that chaotic way kids do when they're burning off energy before dinner. I smiled involuntarily, thinking how nice it was to see the playground being used again. There's something hopeful about the sound of children's laughter, something that makes even the loneliest person feel connected to the continuity of life. But as I watched, something seemed off about the scene. The children weren't running or chasing each other. They weren't talking or laughing. In fact, they seemed to be perfectly still, standing at various spots around the playground like mannequins arranged in a store window. One stood beside the slide, another near the swings, a third by the seesaw. They were just standing there. I squinted through my windshield, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. The summer evening light was starting to fade, casting long shadows across the street, and maybe I was just seeing things that weren't there. It had been a long day, and I'd been putting in extra hours at the office lately, partly to keep busy, and partly because going home to an empty house was becoming increasingly difficult. But then, as I continued to watch, something happened that made my skin crawl. All of the children turned to look at me simultaneously. Not one after another, as you might expect if they'd heard my car or noticed me sitting there. All at once, in perfect unison, their heads swiveled in my direction like they were connected by invisible strings controlled by the same puppeteer. And they smiled. The smiles were identical. Wide, bright, and somehow wrong. Too wide for children's faces, too perfect, too symmetrical. It was the kind of smile you might see in an advertisement or a school photograph, except these smiles never wavered, never changed, never looked anything but artificial. I sat in my car, staring across the street at these strange children who were staring back at me with their unnatural smiles, and felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm summer air. There was something deeply unsettling about the scene, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Then, just as suddenly as they had turned to look at me, they turned away again, resuming their motionless positions around the playground. I blinked, shook my head, and when I looked again, they were gone. The playground stood empty in the gathering dusk, the swings moving slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel from inside my car. I sat there for another few minutes, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing, before finally gathering the courage to get out and walk to my front door. That night, I stood at my living room window for a long time, looking out the playground across the street. It remained empty, lit only by a single street light that cast everything in a yellowish glow. The swings moved occasionally when the wind picked up, creating shadows that danced across the ground. But there was no sign of the children I thought I'd seen earlier. I convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by stress and loneliness. The human brain, I reasoned, sometimes sees patterns and creates meaning where none exists. I'd probably seen shadows or movement from some other source, and my mind had filled in the details, creating the illusion of children where there were none. But the next evening, they were back. I'd made a point of arriving home earlier, curious to see if the children would appear again. This time, I parked across the street from the playground and sat in my car with the engine running, watching carefully as the sun began to set. At first, there was nothing. The playground sat empty, as it had for months, the metal equipment reflecting the last rays of sunlight. A neighbor walked by with their dog, and a few cars passed on their way home from work. But the playground remained deserted. Then, as the shadows grew longer and the light began to fade from gold to amber to deep orange, they appeared, not walking onto the playground from any direction, not climbing over the fence or emerging from behind the equipment. They simply materialized, as if they had been there all along and had just become visible to me. One moment, the playground was empty. The next moment, there were 5 children standing motionless in various positions around the area. This time, I could see them more clearly. They appeared to be between 6 and 10 years old. though it was difficult to determine their exact ages, because their faces had a strange, ageless quality. Their skin was pale, not the healthy pale of children who spent too much time indoors, but the grayish-white pale of something that had never seen sunlight. Their hair hung limp and colorless around their faces, and their clothes, while appearing to be normal children's clothing, seemed faded and worn, as if they had been left in water too long. But it was their eyes that disturbed me most. Where children's eyes should have been bright and curious, these children had eyes that were completely white, not clouded by cataracts or disease, but pure white, like polished marble. They never blinked, these white eyes, just stared with an intensity that was deeply unnerving. And again, when I focused on them, they all turned to look at me at exactly the same moment, the same synchronized movement, the same identical smiles spreading across their faces with mechanical precision. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white with tension. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to drive away, to not look at these children any longer, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from them. They stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, smiling their identical smiles and staring at me with their white, unblinking eyes. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone again, leaving the playground empty except for the equipment and the growing shadows. I sat in my car for another 20 minutes, waiting to see if they would reappear, but they didn't. Eventually, I drove home and spent the rest of the evening pacing around my house, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen wasn't real. But I knew it was real. Whatever those things were, wherever they had come from, they were definitely real. That night, I called my sister Jessica in Portland. "Ray," she said when she answered the phone, her voice bright with surprise. "How are you doing?" "I was just thinking about you." I'm okay," I lied. "How are Tom and the kids?" We chatted for a few minutes about her family, her job, the unusually cool summer they were having in Oregon. Normal sibling conversation that made me feel temporarily grounded in reality. But eventually, I worked up the courage to ask the question I'd really called to ask. "Jess," I said carefully, "do you remember when we were kids? Did you ever see things that weren't there?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean? Like imaginary friends?" "No, not imaginary friends. More like people who looked real but weren't real. People who appeared and disappeared." Another pause, longer this time. "Ray, are you feeling okay? You sound stressed." "I'm fine," I said quickly. I've been having some weird dreams lately. Probably just work stress." We talked for a few more minutes before hanging up, but I could tell Jessica was worried about me. She'd been trying to get me to come visit ever since the divorce, convinced that I was spiraling into depression, alone in the house where Linda and I had planned to raise a family. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was losing my mind. But the next evening, I was back in my car, across from the playground, waiting to see if the children would appear again. They did. This time there were 7 of them, and they were positioned closer to the street. Not on the playground equipment itself, but standing along the fence that separated the playground from the sidewalk. They appeared just as the sun touched the horizon, materializing out of thin air like they had the previous nights. The additional children looked exactly like the others, pale skin, white eyes, limp hair, and those horrible identical smiles. They stood perfectly still, perfectly synchronized, like a row of disturbing dolls, arranged by someone with a very sick sense of humor. And once again, when I focused on them, they all turned to look at me simultaneously. But this time, something else happened. One of the children, a girl who appeared to be about 8 years old, wearing a faded yellow dress that looked like it had been purchased decades ago, raised her hand and waved at me. Not a normal child's wave, enthusiastic and chaotic. This was a slow, deliberate movement, her hand moving back and forth with mechanical precision, while her face maintained that same unsettling smile. The other children remained motionless, but they all continued to stare at me with their white, unblinking eyes. I felt my heart rate spike as I watched this impossible scene. Children don't behave this way. Children don't appear and disappear like ghosts. Children don't have white eyes and identical smiles and move with supernatural synchronization. I started my car and drove home as fast as I safely could, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. That night, I did something I probably should have done days earlier. I went online and started researching. I searched for everything I could think of. Children appearing and disappearing, supernatural encounters playground, hallucinations children, white eyes, mass hysteria, suburban neighborhoods. Most of what I found was either obvious fiction or the ramblings of people who clearly had serious mental health issues, but buried in a forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena. I found a post that made my blood run cold. The post was from someone calling themselves Sleepless in Seattle, and it described an experience remarkably similar to mine. This person claimed to have seen children appearing on a playground near their apartment building in Washington state. Children with pale skin, white eyes, and identical smiles who appeared only at dusk and disappeared before dawn. According to the post, the children had appeared for several weeks, getting progressively closer to the apartment building each night. The poster claimed that neighbors had started disappearing. First, an elderly man who lived alone, then a young woman who had recently moved to the area. The post ended abruptly, with no follow-up from the original poster. I read through the replies, which ranged from genuine concern to obvious mockery. Several people claimed to have had similar experiences in other parts of the country. Always children with white eyes, always appearing at dusk, always moving closer over time. One reply particularly caught my attention. It was from someone called Nightmare Watcher, who claimed to be a researcher of supernatural phenomena. According to this person, the children were collectors, entities that appeared to gather people who had become isolated from their communities. The poster theorized that loneliness and depression made people more vulnerable to these entities, and that they targeted individuals who wouldn't be immediately missed if they disappeared. I spent the rest of the night reading similar accounts, each one more disturbing than the last. By the time the sun came up, I was convinced that I was either having a complete psychological breakdown or that I was being stalked by something genuinely supernatural. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. The next day at work, I tried to focus on my insurance claims and forget about the strange children, but I found my attention constantly drifting to the clock. As 5 o'clock approached, I felt a growing sense of dread about going home and facing another encounter with whatever was happening on that playground. I decided to stop by the local police station on my way home. Officer Patricia Williams was working the front desk when I walked in, and she greeted me with the kind of professional courtesy that police officers reserve for citizens who appear to be stable and law-abiding. "How can I help you today, sir?" "I'd like to report some suspicious activity in my neighborhood," I said, trying to sound as rational as possible. "What kind of suspicious activity?" "There are children who appear on the playground across from my house every evening around sunset. They don't seem to belong to anyone in the neighborhood, and their behavior is unusual." Officer Williams pulled out a form and started writing down my information. "Can you describe these children?" I hesitated, knowing how crazy my description was going to sound. "They're very pale, and they have white eyes. They don't speak or play, they just stand there. And they all move at exactly the same time, like they're being controlled by someone." The officer stopped writing and looked up at me with an expression that I recognized immediately. It was the same look Jessica had given me over the phone. Concern mixed with the kind of careful attention you give to someone who might be having a mental health crisis. "Sir," she said gently, "when you say they have white eyes, do you mean they might be blind or suffering from some kind of medical condition?" "No," I said, feeling increasingly foolish. "I mean their eyes are completely white. No pupils, no irises, just white." Officer Williams set down her pen and folded her hands on the desk. "Mr. Miller, have you been under any unusual stress lately? Any major life changes or traumatic events?" I sighed, knowing that I'd lost any credibility I might have had. "I recently went through a divorce. I've been living alone for the first time in years." "I see. And you say these children appear every evening?" "Yes, right around sunset." "Have any of your neighbors mentioned seeing these children?" No, I haven't asked them." Officer Williams picked up her pen again and made a few more notes. "I'll tell you what, Mr. Miller. I'll have a patrol car swing by your neighborhood this evening around the time you say these children appear. If there are children behaving strangely or without proper supervision, we'll definitely look into it." I thanked her and left the station, knowing that the patrol car wouldn't find anything. Whatever these children were, they clearly existed in a space that normal people couldn't perceive. But I was wrong about that. That evening, I positioned myself at my living room window with a pair of binoculars, watching the playground as the sun began to set. Right on schedule, the children appeared. There were 9 of them now, and they had moved even closer to the street. Several were standing right at the fence line now, their pale hands gripping the chain links as they stared directly at my house. About 20 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up and parked across the street from the playground. I watched through my binoculars as Officer Williams got out of the car and walked around the perimeter of the playground, shining her flashlight into every corner. The children were standing right there in plain sight, but she walked right past them without any indication that she could see them. At one point, she actually walked between 2 of the children who were standing about 6 feet apart. Neither the children nor the officer showed any sign of awareness of the other. Officer Williams spent about 15 minutes examining the playground, even checking behind the equipment and in the overgrown areas around the fence. Finally, she got back in her car and drove away. The children remained in their positions, staring at my house with their white eyes and identical smiles. That's when I realized that I was completely alone in this. Whatever these entities were, whatever they wanted, I was the only one who could see them, and they knew it. Over the next few days, I tried everything I could think of to document what was happening. I set up a video camera pointed at the playground, but when I reviewed the footage the next morning, it showed nothing but an empty playground throughout the entire evening. I tried taking photographs with both my phone and an old digital camera, but the images never showed the children, even when I could see them clearly with my own eyes. I even went so far as to knock on my neighbors' doors, asking if they'd noticed any strange activity around the playground. Mrs. Henderson, who lived in the house to my left, said she sometimes heard children playing in the evening but assumed they belonged to families on the next street over. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, who lived to my right, said they hadn't noticed anything unusual at all. The most frustrating conversation was with the Kowalski family, who lived directly next to the playground. When I asked if they'd seen any children playing there recently, Mrs. Kowalski looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "Children?" she said. No one plays there anymore. It's been empty for months. You haven't heard anything in the evenings? No voices or sounds of children playing?" "Nothing," she said firmly. "It's been very quiet." But I knew she was wrong. I could see the children every evening, and their numbers were growing. By the end of the first week, there were 12 of them. They had moved beyond the playground fence and were now standing on the sidewalk directly across from my house. During the day, I could see where they had been standing. Not footprints exactly, but areas where the grass seemed to have died or where the pavement looked somehow different, as if it had been exposed to extreme cold. The children themselves never changed. They appeared at the same time each evening, maintained their positions throughout the night, and disappeared just before dawn. They never spoke, never played, never did anything that actual children would do. They just stood there, watching my house with their white eyes and wearing their identical smiles. And every night, they were a little bit closer. I stopped going to work. I called in sick for 3 days straight, then stopped calling altogether. I couldn't focus on insurance claims and policy renewals when I was being stalked by supernatural entities that no one else could see. I spent my days researching online and my evenings watching the children from behind the safety of my locked doors and drawn curtains. The online research led me down increasingly dark rabbit holes. I found accounts of similar encounters from all over the world, always following the same pattern. Isolated individuals would begin seeing pale children with white eyes. The children would appear with increasing frequency and get progressively closer, and then the person would disappear. In every case where there was follow-up information, the person had vanished without a trace. No signs of struggle, no evidence of where they had gone, just empty houses and confused neighbors who couldn't understand what had happened. I also found references to these entities in older texts, folklore and legends from various cultures that described pale ones or hollow children who would appear to people who had become disconnected from their communities. According to these sources, the entities were drawn to loneliness and despair, feeding on isolation and using it to bridge the gap between their world and ours. The most disturbing theory I encountered suggested that the entities weren't trying to harm their targets, but rather to collect them. The idea was that people who had become truly alone in the world, people whose disappearance wouldn't be immediately noticed or investigated, were somehow valuable to these beings. The theories about why varied, but all of them ended with the same conclusion. The person would be taken to wherever these entities came from, and they would never return. By the second week, the children were standing in my front yard. I woke up one morning to find small, pale handprints on my windows, not on the outside, where they might have been left by neighborhood kids playing pranks, but on the inside, as if the children had somehow been in my house during the night. I checked every lock, every window, every possible entry point, but found no sign of how anyone could have gotten inside. The doors were still locked, the windows were still latched, and the security system I'd installed after the divorce hadn't been triggered. But the handprints were there, small and perfect, covering the glass from floor to ceiling on every window that faced the street. That evening, I didn't even need to look outside to know the children were there. I could feel their presence, a cold weight pressing against the walls of my house. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through the curtains, I saw them standing on my front lawn, arranged in a perfect circle around the old oak tree that Linda and I had planted during our first spring in the house. There were 15 of them now, and they were all facing my house. Their white eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, and their smiles looked wider than ever, stretching their faces in ways that human faces shouldn't stretch. I spent that night barricaded in my bedroom, with furniture pushed against the door and every light in the house turned on. I could hear them outside, not voices exactly, but a low humming sound, like a chorus singing a song with no words. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the walls and floor until my entire house felt like the inside of a tuning fork. The next morning, I found more handprints, these ones leading from the front door to the bottom of the stairs, small, pale prints that seemed to glow faintly in the morning light. I followed the trail upstairs and found that it led directly to my bedroom door, where it stopped abruptly. They had been inside my house. Somehow, despite all my precautions, they had gotten inside and walked right up to the room where I was sleeping. I called Jessica again, though I knew she wouldn't believe me. "Ray, you're scaring me," she said after I'd finished describing what was happening. "You need to see someone, a doctor, a therapist, someone who can help you." "They're real, Jess," I insisted. "They're not hallucinations or stress dreams. They're actually here, and they're getting closer every night." "Okay," she said in the tone people use when they're trying to humor someone who's having a breakdown. "Let's say they're real. What do you think they want?" "I think they want me," I said quietly. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Ray, I'm going to book a flight. I'm coming to see you." "No," I said quickly. "Don't come here. It's not safe. It's not safe because there are no supernatural children stalking you," Jessica said firmly. "It's not safe because you're having some kind of psychological crisis, and you need help." I hung up on her. I couldn't deal with her concern and disbelief on top of everything else that was happening. That afternoon, I went to the hardware store and bought every security device they had. Motion sensors, door alarms, window locks, even a few cameras that I hoped might work better than the ones I'd tried before. I spent the rest of the day turning my house into a fortress, installing sensors and alarms on every possible entry point. But as the sun began to set, I realized that none of it was going to matter. The children didn't need doors or windows to get inside. They existed in a space between the physical world and somewhere else, and no amount of locks or alarms was going to keep them out if they decided they wanted in. That evening, they appeared right outside my front door. I watched through the peephole as they materialized one by one on my front porch, their pale forms crowding together in the small space. They stood facing the door, their white eyes staring directly at the peephole as if they knew I was watching them. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, one of them spoke. "Raymond," said a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater. "Raymond, come outside." It was a child's voice, high and sweet, but there was something wrong with it. It echoed strangely, as if it were being spoken in a vast, empty space instead of on my front porch. "We want to play with you, Raymond," said another voice, this one slightly deeper, but equally wrong. "Come outside, Raymond," said a third voice. "Come and play." Soon all of them were speaking, their voices layering over each other in a discordant chorus that seemed to penetrate the walls of my house. They repeated my name over and over, each pronunciation slightly different, as if they weren't quite sure how human speech was supposed to work. "Raymond, Raymond, Raymond." I backed away from the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The voices continued for what felt like hours, sometimes speaking in unison, sometimes overlapping, sometimes falling silent for long stretches before starting up again. Around midnight, the voices stopped, but I could still feel their presence outside my door. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my living room with all the lights on, watching the front door and waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. When the sun came up, they were gone, just like always. But they had left something behind. On my front door, carved deep into the wood, was a message. "Soon." The letters were crude and uneven, as if they had been scratched into the wood with fingernails or small knives. The cuts were deep enough that I could see all the way through to the other side of the door in some places. I spent that day online, desperately searching for any information about how to stop what was happening to me. Most of the advice I found was useless. Salt circles, religious symbols, iron nails, various herbs and crystals that were supposed to ward off supernatural entities. None of it felt substantial enough to deal with what I was facing, but I found one account that gave me hope. It was from someone calling themselves Escaped the Hollow, and they claimed to have survived an encounter with the pale children. According to this person, the key was to break the pattern of isolation that attracted the entities in the first place. They had to reconnect with other people to make themselves part of a community again, to prove that they weren't truly alone in the world. The poster claimed that they had done this by going to stay with family members, by forcing themselves to be around other people constantly until the children eventually lost interest and moved on to easier targets. It wasn't much, but it was the first suggestion I'd found that offered any hope of survival. I called Jessica back. "Ray," she said, her voice filled with relief. I was about to call the police and ask them to do a welfare check on you. Jess, I said, I need to ask you a favor. I need to come stay with you for a while. Of course, she said immediately. How soon can you get here? Tonight. I'm going to pack some things and drive straight through. Ray, what's wrong? You sound terrified. I looked out my front window at the playground across the street. Even in the bright afternoon sunlight, I could see faint outlines of the children, like shadows that shouldn't exist. They were waiting for evening to come, waiting for darkness to give them substance again. I'll explain when I get there, I said, but I have to leave tonight. I spent the rest of the afternoon packing a bag and making preparations to leave. I wasn't sure how long I'd need to stay away, so I packed enough clothes for several weeks and gathered all my important documents. I even wrote a letter explaining what had been happening, just in case something went wrong and I didn't make it to Oregon. As the sun began to set, I loaded my car and prepared to leave. My plan was simple: drive straight through the night, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the children before they realized I was gone. But as I carried my last bag out to the car, I realized that they already knew. The children were standing in my driveway, not just a few of them, but dozens. They filled my entire front yard, standing shoulder to shoulder in perfect rows, like an army of pale, smiling soldiers. Their white eyes reflected the setting sun like mirrors, and their identical smiles seemed wider than ever. And blocking the path to my car, standing directly behind my Honda Civic, was the largest one I'd ever seen. This child, though it was clearly no longer a child in any meaningful sense, stood at least 7 feet tall, its limbs stretched and elongated beyond any human proportion. Its face was the same featureless mask as the others, but its smile stretched from ear to ear, revealing rows of teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for any mouth. "Going somewhere, Raymond?" it asked in a voice that sounded like wind blowing through a cemetery. I dropped my bag and ran back into the house, slamming the door behind me and throwing every lock I had installed. Through the windows, I could see the children moving closer to the house, their synchronized movements creating a hypnotic pattern that hurt to watch. I was trapped. Over the next few hours, I watched helplessly as the children surrounded my house completely. They stood pressed against every window, their pale hands leaving those same glowing prints on the glass. The humming sound started again, louder than ever, vibrating through the walls and making the entire house shake. Around midnight, the front door began to rattle, not like someone was trying to break in, but like the door itself was trying to open. The locks held, but I could hear the wood creaking and straining as something pulled at it from the other side. Then the windows started rattling too, and I realized that the house itself was being pulled apart by invisible forces. I ran upstairs to my bedroom and barricaded myself inside, pushing my dresser and bed against the door. But even there, I could hear them getting closer. Footsteps in the hallway, small hands scratching at my bedroom door, voices calling my name from every direction. "Raymond! Come out, Raymond! We want to show you something." "It's time to go, Raymond. Time to come with us. You'll like it where we're going, Raymond. You won't be alone anymore." The scratching at my door grew louder and more insistent, and I could see the wood beginning to splinter under the assault. Whatever these things were, they were done, waiting. I looked around my bedroom. desperate for any means of escape, but there was nowhere to go. The windows faced the front yard, where I knew more of the children were waiting. The door was the only way out, and that way was blocked by entities that meant to take me to wherever they came from. Then I remembered something from my online research. One of the accounts had mentioned that the entities couldn't complete their collection if their target was already connected to someone else, if someone was actively looking for them and would notice their absence immediately. I grabbed my phone and called Jessica. "Ray?" she answered on the first ring. "Where are you? I've been waiting for you to call." "Jess," I said, speaking as quickly as I could while the scratching at my door grew louder. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm in danger, real danger. If I don't call you back in exactly 1 hour, I need you to call the police and tell them to come to my house immediately." "Ray, what's happening? You're scaring me. Just promise me," I said, as the door began to crack down the middle. "Promise me you'll call the police if I don't check in." I promised, but the door exploded inward, and they poured into my room like a flood of pale shadows. I dropped the phone and scrambled backward until I hit the wall, trapped in the corner with nowhere left to run. The children filled my bedroom, their white eyes glowing in the darkness, their identical smiles stretching their faces into impossible shapes. They didn't rush toward me or grab me immediately. Instead, they just stood there, watching me with patient, hungry expressions. The tall one, the one who had spoken to me in the driveway, pushed through the crowd and approached me slowly. "It's time, Raymond," it said in its wind-through-graveyard voice. "Time to stop being alone." "I'm not alone," I said desperately. "My sister's expecting me. People will look for me if I disappear." The thing that looked like a child, but wasn't, laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "No one looked for the others," it said. "No one will look for you." It reached toward me with one impossibly long arm, its fingers stretching like pale spider legs. I pressed myself against the wall, but there was nowhere left to go. Just as its fingers were about to touch my face, my phone rang. The sound was jarring in the silence of my bedroom, and the children all turned toward the phone with expressions of confusion and hunger. It was Jessica calling back because she was worried about me. "Answer it," the tall child said, its smile never wavering. "Tell her you're fine. Tell her you won't be coming to visit after all." I looked at the phone, then at the crowd of pale children surrounding me. If I answered, I could reassure Jessica and she wouldn't call the police. But if I didn't answer, she would know something was wrong. The phone continued to ring. "Answer it, Raymond," the child repeated, its voice becoming more insistent. I shook my head. The phone rang 4 more times, then went to voicemail. A moment later, it chimed with a text message from Jessica. "Ray, I'm worried. Call me back right now or I'm calling 911. The tall child hissed, a sound like steam escaping from a kettle. "You've made this more difficult than it needed to be," it said. But I could see uncertainty in its white eyes now, confusion about what to do next. The children were used to taking people who wouldn't be missed, people whose disappearance would be attributed to mental illness or voluntary abandonment. They weren't prepared for someone who had established a safety net, someone who would be actively searched for if they vanished. My phone chimed again with another text from Jessica. "Calling police now. Hold on." The children began to flicker their solid forms becoming translucent. The tall one made one last desperate reach toward me, but its fingers passed through my face like cold smoke. "Next time, Raymond," it whispered as it faded away. "When you're truly alone again, we'll be waiting." And then they were gone, leaving my bedroom empty except for the broken door and the lingering smell of something that might have been ozone or might have been death. 15 minutes later, the police arrived to find me sitting in my bedroom, surrounded by the wreckage of my barricade, babbling about children with white eyes. They were professional and kind, but I could tell they thought I'd had some kind of breakdown. Officer Williams, the same one I'd spoken to at the station, took my statement while paramedics checked me for injuries. "Mr. Miller," she said gently, "we've examined your house thoroughly. There's no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone else was here tonight. The damage to your door appears to have been done from the inside." I started to protest, to insist that the children had been real. But then I saw the look in her eyes. The same look Jessica had given me. The same look everyone had been giving me for weeks. "I think I need help," I said quietly. "I think that's a very good idea," Officer Williams replied. The next morning, Jessica arrived from Oregon. She took one look at my house, the broken door, the mysterious handprints, the carved message, the dead patches of grass in my yard, and immediately made arrangements for me to see a psychiatrist. Dr. Sarah Martinez was a specialist in trauma-related disorders, and she listened patiently as I described my experiences with the pale children. When I finished my story, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Miller," she said finally, "isolation and grief can manifest in many different ways. What you've described sounds like a very vivid series of hallucinations brought on by stress, loneliness, and the trauma of your divorce." "But the handprints," I said, "the damage to my house. How do you explain that? Sleepwalking is more common than people realize," she said. "And it's not unusual for people experiencing severe stress to act out their hallucinations in physical ways, even when they're not consciously aware of doing so." I wanted to argue with her, to insist that what I'd experienced was real, but part of me was relieved by her explanation. If the children were just hallucinations, then they couldn't hurt me. If they were products of my own mind, then I could get better with treatment and therapy. I moved in with Jessica temporarily and started seeing Dr. Martinez twice a week. I took medication for anxiety and depression and slowly began to feel like myself again. The children stopped appearing in my dreams, and I stopped checking over my shoulder every few minutes, expecting to see pale figures with white eyes watching me. After 3 months, I felt ready to return to my house and my life. Jessica drove me back to Sycamore Ridge Drive on a sunny afternoon in October. The neighborhood looked exactly the same. Neat lawns, quiet streets, the kind of place where the biggest excitement was still Mrs. Henderson's cat getting stuck in trees. But as we pulled into my driveway, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The playground across the street wasn't empty anymore. There were children playing there, real children, with normal skin and normal eyes, laughing and running around the equipment like children should. 3 or 4 of them, maybe 6 or 7 years old, wearing bright summer clothes and filling the air with the sound of healthy, happy childhood. "Look at that," Jessica said, smiling. It's nice to see kids using that playground again. The neighborhood was probably just waiting for summer to end and school to start. I nodded and smiled back, but something felt wrong about the scene. The children were too perfect, too coordinated in their movements. And when one of them, a little boy with sandy brown hair, looked in my direction, I saw something familiar in his eyes. Not white eyes this time, but normal brown eyes with normal pupils and irises. Except there was something in those eyes that I recognized. Something cold and patient and hungry. The boy smiled at me, and for just a moment, his smile stretched a little too wide. Then Jessica was opening her car door and talking about helping me unpack, and the moment passed. When I looked at the playground again, the children appeared perfectly normal, playing and laughing with the careless joy that only real children possess. But that evening, as the sun began to set, I found myself standing at my living room window, watching the playground across the street. The children were still there, but they had stopped playing. They stood motionless around the equipment, their faces turned toward my house, wearing identical smiles that looked nothing like the innocent expressions they'd worn during the day. And their eyes, which had been brown and blue and green in the afternoon sunlight, were now completely white. I closed the curtains and backed away from the window, my heart pounding with familiar terror. Dr. Martinez had been wrong. The children weren't hallucinations brought on by stress and isolation. They were real. They had always been real. And now they had learned to hide in plain sight. That night, I heard the soft sound of children's laughter coming from outside my house. Not the joyful laughter of kids playing games, but something else entirely. Something that sounded like laughter, but felt like screaming. I didn't look outside. I didn't open the curtains or peek through the blinds. I just sat in my living room with all the lights on, waiting for morning to come. But I knew they were out there, waiting for me to be alone again, waiting for the right moment to finish what they had started. And I knew that eventually, despite all my precautions and all my connections to the world, that moment would come. Because everyone ends up alone, eventually. This account was found on the computer of Raymond Miller, who disappeared from his home on Sycamore Ridge Drive on November 3rd. Police found no signs of forced entry or struggle. Mr. Miller's car was still in his driveway. His doors were locked from the inside, and all his personal belongings remained undisturbed. Neighbors reported seeing children playing on the playground across from Mr. Miller's house in the days leading up to his disappearance, but none could identify the children or say which families they belonged to. The playground has been empty since Mr. Miller's disappearance was reported. Mr. Miller's sister, Jessica Thompson of Portland, Oregon, told investigators that her brother had been receiving treatment for stress-related hallucinations, but had seemed to be improving. She was the last person to speak with him during a phone call on the evening of November 2nd, in which Mr. Miller told her he was feeling much better and looking forward to getting back to his normal routine. The case remains open, but with no leads or evidence of foul play, it has been classified as a voluntary missing person case. Anyone with information regarding the whereabouts of Raymond Miller is asked to contact the local police department.